Today is lesson number 12, which is tithe and offerings. And we'll talk about God's plan of sustaining his mission, and take a look at some of the history and also some of the commandments and their relevance to the New Testament era revealed in apostolic writings. So first thing to do is to take a look at some passages that describe the appropriate attitude towards material possessions, generally speaking. The first question is, who is the real owner of everything? The book of Psalms, chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. Here's the text. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. So this is a very simple question. Who is the real owner of everything? God is, Creator is, in virtue of the fact that he created everything. Here's the text again. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, that is, everything that's in it. For he has founded, he has created it. This is the first point of realization, that there is a possessor, there is a real owner of everything, in virtue of being a creator of everything. Who makes us capable of acquiring wealth? The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, verse 18. Deuteronomy 8:18. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is this day. So even the money that we earn or the wealth that we get or accumulate, the Bible says that it is God who gives us the power or the strength to get this, because we are also his creation. What is then the proper term to describe anything that we may give to God? 1 Chronicles 29:14. 1 Chronicles 29:14. But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of all you have, and of your own have we given you. Okay? So what would be then the proper term to describe anything we may give to God? These are the words of the King Solomon, who is praying at the time of dedication of the temple. And he says that all things come from you, and therefore whatever we have given you, that's your own, and of your own have we given you. So the proper term then would be returning. God gives us everything, he owns everything, and whatever we have is his. Therefore, anything that we decide to donate or to sacrifice, so to speak, or to give to God, this is giving back. This is returning. That's the first section. And though it is pretty straightforward, let's take a look if there are any questions, something to discuss, maybe share your thoughts and so forth. If you will be speaking, please unmute yourself first.
You used the term possessor. There is a possessor. I've never thought of that before. Of course, I know all things are his and belong to him. But to me, possession is a little more territorial.
Yes.
And maybe slightly negative.
Well,
But-
depending on the version of the Bible that you would use, sometimes you would have that specific term.
Yeah, but to say that I possess God's love, then that's quite the opposite.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Anyone else would like to comment or ask a question or double check anything? I think the first section is pretty self-explanatory. This is just acknowledging that anything that we have really belongs to God, and He's the owner of everything. Now, let me share my screen again. The next section is history of tithe. The word tithe means a tenth or a 10%. And the first passage where we have this term in the Bible is the book of Genesis, chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. Let's read it and then answer some questions. Genesis 14, 18 through 20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. That's the first time the Bible uses the term tenth or tithe. So, first question is, who received the tithe? The answer is Melchizedek. He was a priest of God Most High. What was the tithe given of? Here's the answer. It says, and Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Well, the term everything in that context was the plunders of war, or anything that Abraham was able to retrieve when he was saving Lot and his family and other prisoners of war, captives that were taken by a coalition that invaded the valley of 5 cities, where in one of which Lot lived with his family. So the answer is a tenth of everything that he had at that point when he met the priest of God Most High. This is what Abraham did. That's the first mention of this tithe being used to finance the priests and ministers of God. Let's go to the next passage. That's the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verses 20 through 22. Genesis 28, 20 through 22. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Here are some questions. What is the purpose of tithe? Jacob says, it shall be for God's house. God's house. What is the tithe given of? The answer is, of all that you give me. Anything that God would bless me with, Jacob says, I will give a full tenth to him. So Jacob is a grandson of Abraham, and we see that he knows about this principle of tithing, of everything, on everything that God gives. Now, let's go to the next passage, which is the book of Leviticus, chapter 27, verse 30. That's the first positive commandment about tithing. Leviticus 27, 30. Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy to the Lord. And here's the question. What is the nature of tithe? It says it is holy. Holy means dedicated, set apart. In this case, dedicated to God. The text literally says, it is holy to the Lord. It belongs to the Lord. The next passage is the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verse 21. What is the designation of tithe? What was it used for? Numbers 18:21. To the Levites, I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service that they do, their service in the tent of meeting. So broadly speaking, this is the purpose of tithe revealed in the Torah, in the books of Moses, in the Pentateuch. This was a payment. This is an inheritance, as the Bible puts it in this version, to the Levites for the service that they do in the tent of meeting. Now, the tribe of Levi was not only ministering in the sanctuary. There is something else that they did. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, verse 10. What else did the tribe of Levi do? Deuteronomy 33:10. It says, they shall teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. They shall put incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar. This is what it says. They shall teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. So when you study it, it turns out that offering sacrifices and actually ministering in the sanctuary and later in the temple only took 2 weeks of the whole year. So there were divisions made, 24 of them, and they would come to minister in the sanctuary for 2 weeks a year. And then the rest of the time, they were doing this. They shall teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. So 50 weeks out of each year, they would spend residing in the cities that were scattered all around the territory of Israel, and they were keepers and teachers of God's will for the people. So there are 2 main purposes of tithe that's revealed, that's ordained in the Bible. That was to provide for those who were ministering in the sanctuary and teaching the people of God the law of God and so forth. this is some history of tithing in the Old Testament era. So before we move on to the New Testament era, let's pause and see if there are any questions, if there is anything that needs to be clarified, and so forth, from what we have already read and discovered tonight. If there is anything to double check on, please let me know.
Why was it just 10 and not 15 or not 5 or any other number?
I don't know. That's just what it is. Well, in Hebrew thinking, 10 is designated by the smallest letter of the alphabet. Before Arabic numbers became popular, the ones that we use right now, right? Each alphabet would typically designate part of its letters to be numbers at the same time. So some of the letters, they have numeric value, and the tiniest letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is Yud, it looks like a comma. Its value and its meaning, when it's used as a number, is 10. Therefore, there was this idea that 10 is like the smallest part that you could give. And there is an example in the book of Daniel, when Daniel is asking for 10 days as the length of the experiment. He says, give us 10 days and then see the results, whether we would be skinnier or otherwise, comparing to those who would eat from the king's table. Remember? So, and the idea is that the 10 days is the least amount of days needed for anything to become clear. So that might be one of the reasons, again, rooted in Hebrew thinking, in Hebrew mentality, but there is no specific open statement in the Bible why it's 10%.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. Anything else?
Yes, the period of the priestly sanctuary service seems rather short. Is that because there were so many capable Levites? Or, which I'm probably leaning toward, God's plan for only 2 weeks?
Well, if you consider what they were doing there for those 2 weeks, when we are talking about priests specifically, right? For example, if a person offers a sin offering or a guilt offering, then only fat with some other minor parts would be burned on the altar, and then the rest of the meat would have to be eaten by the priests, because the statement is that this is what's given to them to take away the sins and the guilt from the people. So during those 2 weeks of the year, they were eating meat heavily. Meat, because that was their duty. That was one of the ways that the sin was, so to speak, transferred from people to the priesthood. And that meat was to be prepared without any spices or salt, or anything of that sort. So it was very, I mean, if you just boil meat without any spices, without anything, it's a pretty, how shall I say it? It's not inviting at all.
Disgusting.
Yeah, and so it was their ministry during those 2 weeks. So I mean, one of the reasons that we could, state was that God was taking care of their health by limiting the amount of time that they would spend there. And then you see, the more you teach, the less you need to eat that meat, because the more educated people are and dedicated to God people are, the less sins are committed, and then there is less need to have atonement for those sins and so forth. And so that's some of the thoughts, but that was God's plan.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, so we have established that we see 10% being called holy to God, and this practice goes back as far as the time of Abraham. So 10% of income, whether it was war, whether it was business, whether it was something planted, animals, I mean, any kind of income a person might have, 10% of it would be dedicated to God to support ministers in the sanctuary and outside the sanctuary. And the majority of time they were just ministers of the word. They were teaching, they were training people to know God's will. So let's move on. I'll mute you all again. Now Jesus comes. Did Jesus abolish tithing? The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 23. Matthew 23, 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the other. So, did Jesus abolish tithing? The answer is no, he did not. He says, this you need to do, and that. So, as you could see, Pharisees, they were very meticulous about returning tithe. You tithe mint and dill and cumin, so even the tiniest seeds. But in other parts of the law, they were negligent. So Jesus says you need to do both this and that. Let's take a look at the epistle to Hebrews, chapter 7, and read first 8 verses and then verse 17. And then we'll ask some questions. Hebrews 7, 1 through 8 and 17. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, Melchizedek, that is, right? And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But the man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. Now, verse 17 says the following: For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. This is a somewhat complicated passage, but the main ideas, I believe, are very clear. Which two priesthoods are compared? The first one is the priesthood or the order of Melchizedek, the one that we just read about in the book of Genesis. And the other is the priesthood of the tribe of Levi. Again, and when we go back to the beginning of chapter 7, first, the author is talking about Melchizedek and what's described about him. And then he talks about those descendants of Levi who receive priestly office and so forth. So two priesthoods are compared: the order of Melchizedek and the order of Levi. What do they have in common? The answer is the tithe. Melchizedek was financed by tithing. He received tithe. And the tribe of Levi received tithes from people. In that, they have the same principle of being financed. So, the question is, who is the one that stays a priest according to the order of Melchizedek? The answer is Jesus Christ. Verse 17 says, well, to have it in the context, let's read 15 and on. This becomes even more evident than when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So Jesus Christ is the priest after the order of Melchizedek. So his priesthood is according to the order of Melchizedek. And that priesthood has tithe in it, as well as the priesthood of the tribe of Levi. Now let's go to our next passage, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 13 and 14. 9, 13 and 14. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. What is the financial structure in the church should be like? What the financial structure in the church should be like? Here's the text again. It says, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. In which way? Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple? So, the financing of the tribe of Levi in the Old Testament is the model that should be repeated in the New Testament era. In the same way the text says, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So, as we can see, first we have this statement in the Epistle to Hebrews that says that in the priesthood of Melchizedek, who is Jesus Christ, right? Tithing is there as well as in the priesthood of Levi. Here, Apostle Paul says that in the same way as ministers of the Old Testament were paid, those who proclaim the gospel should get their living in the same manner. This concludes our next portion. Let's talk. If there are any questions, if there is something to ask, go ahead. Well, if everything is clear and there are no questions, let's move to the next section. The next question is the distribution and use of tithe. At this point, we were reading the passages that tell about the principle and commandments about tithe. And then the next question is, how was it used? The distribution and use of tithe. First, let's recreate the organizational structure of God's people, specifically in the context of serving God. So, first level, we could read about in the book of Acts, chapter 15, verse 21. Acts 15, 21. For from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who proclaim him, for he is read every Sabbath in the synagogues. So the first level of the system that was designed to sustain spiritual life for the people of God was the synagogue. The synagogue is a place of weekly worship services. We just read that every Sabbath there is the service, the book of Moses is read, and so forth. So the synagogue is the first level. Then the second level, we could read about it in the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 6 through 8. 35, 6 through 8. The cities that you give to the Levites shall be the 6 cities of refuge, where you shall permit the manslayer to flee, and in addition to them you shall give 42 cities. All the cities that you give to the Levites shall be 48, with their pasture lands. And as for the cities that you shall give from the possession of the people of Israel, from the larger tribe you shall take many, and from the smaller tribes you shall take few. each in proportion to the inheritance that it inherits, shall give of its cities to the Levites. So as you could see, there were cities where Levites lived. And this is the second level. So the whole territory of Israel had 48 cities where priests and Levites lived. And it was spread evenly. As you remember, their main service was to teach people. So there was always a Levitical or priestly city nearby. And these ministers, they would be responsible for organizing worship services and teaching sessions in the synagogues of each city, village, and so forth. That's the second level, the Levitical cities. And the third level, of course, is the temple, where the sanctuary stood, beginning with the time of David. It was located in the city of Jerusalem. Let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. Chronicles 3:1. It says, "Then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to David his father, at the place that David had appointed, on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite." So the temple there was only one temple. There were 48 cities where the tribe of Levi lived, the priests and Levites, and there were many, many, many synagogues in all cities throughout the land. So this is the organizational structure. Weekly services were conducted in the synagogue. Then, organizationally, each synagogue would be under the care of one of the cities where priests and Levites lived. And then the temple was a place where people would be going 3 times a year. That was a requirement for 3 celebrations, 3 yearly feasts. Of course, anyone could visit, anytime, but according to the law of Moses, according to Torah, 3 times a year they would go to Jerusalem to worship in God's temple. So keeping this structure in mind, let's ask the question, what was the flow of tithe? Let's go to the book of Numbers, chapter 18, verses 25 through 28. Numbers 18, 25 through 28. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Moreover, you shall speak and say to the Levites, when you take from the people of Israel the tithe that I have given you from them for your inheritance, then you shall present a contribution from it to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. And your contribution shall be counted to you as though it were the grain of the threshing floor and as the fullness of the winepress. So you shall also present a contribution to the Lord from all your tithes, which you receive from the people of Israel, and from all you shall give the Lord's contribution to Aaron the priest." So this is the first passage. Was the financial structure centralized? The answer is yes. Yes. The Levites would receive the tithe from the people, and then, it would be distributed according to specific instructions. The next question, starting with what level was tithe used? It says, when you Levites receive tithe from the people, where exactly was it happening? Let's go to our next passage, which is the book of Nehemiah, chapter 10, verses 37 through 39. Also, to bring to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God, the firstborn of our sons and of our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and of our flocks, and to bring the first of our dough and our contributions, the fruit of every tree, and wine, and the oil to the priests, to the chambers of the house of our God, and to bring to the Levites the tithes from our ground. For it is the Levites who collect the tithes in all our towns where we labor. And the priest, the son of Aaron, shall be with the Levites when the Levites receive the tithe. And the Levites shall bring up the tithe of the tithes to the house of our God, to the chambers of the storehouse. So here's the picture that's described. Again, the question is, starting with what level was tithe used? The answer is starting with second level. The Levites would take the tithes from the people, and then the next question is, where did tithe go after that? The answer is to Jerusalem. What percent was sent to the next level? The answer is 10%. So the tithe over the tithe received. So tithe was collected by Levites in the cities, and then it was used in those cities where they lived, and the tenth would travel to the sanctuary. But that was not done by people, that was done by Levites and priests. So this is the use, this is the structure that was put in place. Did apostles keep a centralized financial system? 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 3. 1 Corinthians 16, first 3 verses. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. So as you could see, the topic is finances, collections for the saints. And this is something that was done in other churches as well. So as the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. After money is collected, then with representatives, they are sent to Jerusalem. So what's the answer to the question whether apostles kept a centralized financial system? The answer is yes. This is God's system. This is what he established, and we see apostles following the same pattern when dealing with finances in the early church. So this was the end of our next section. If there is something to discuss, please let me know. Well, I don't hear any questions. I don't see anyone raising hand.
Pretty straightforward. Follow the rules.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, we have one tiny section. So let me press this again. Our last section of today's lesson is blessings of tithing. List the blessings promised to those faithful in tithing. The book of Malachi, chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. The book of Malachi, chapter 3, verses 10 through 12. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house, and thereby put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open the windows of heaven for you and pour down for you a blessing until there is no more need. I will rebuke the devourer for you, so that it will not destroy the fruits of your soil, and your vine in the field shall not fail to bear, says the Lord of hosts. And all nations will call you blessed, for you will be a land of delight, says the Lord of hosts. So a number of blessings are promised to those who are faithful in tithing. And these blessings are, if you go to verse 12, nations will call you blessed, so they will be recognized as those who are blessed. Then God's protection from losses is promised. And God's blessings are promised as well. Put me to the test, God says. I will open the windows of heaven and pour down blessings. So these are some of the promises. Now, what is another aspect of God's blessing? The book of Proverbs, chapter 10, verse 22. Proverbs 10:22. The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. This is a fascinating statement because, it's one thing to become rich or become wealthy, right? To have material possessions. And then another thing totally to have no sorrow with it. But the blessing of the Lord does exactly that thing. The blessing of God brings material side of the blessing as well, and adds no sorrow with it. So a person could enjoy whatever blessing God sends his or her way. So this is a tiny, short section about blessings of tithing.